Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. My name is Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer at Newsela. And today we're going to start with a little bit of a different angle. As you can see, we have a quote here on X from Mark Cuban. And the quote reads, "There are generally two types of LLM users, those that use it to learn everything and those that use it so they don't have to learn anything." Which I kind of love. It's a kind of a nice summation of where we find ourselves regarding the use of LLMs and AI. And also because it reminds me of a quote that I often joke around with my family. There are two types of people in this world, people who believe that there are two types of people and people who don't. And so Mark Cuban is dividing the world thusly by categories of how you choose to use the AI for its productivity gains. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Productivity gains as seen from the workplace in a study that was recently published in the Harvard Business Review, which I think is an interesting lens to take to productivity and the use of AI. And then we're going to turn the camera towards the role that teachers play and the productivity gains that some are saying are possible with AI. And we're going to finish it off with a preview of tomorrow's episode, where we take a much more skeptical look at these gains to examine whether they're actually real. With Mark Cuban's quote in mind, let's jump into the conversation here. So just to briefly give you an overview of what this recently published study in the Harvard Business Review is saying, what was the nature of the study? And basically the authors are saying that AI doesn't reduce work, it intensifies it. And the overview of the study is that they did an 8-month ethnographic study of 200 tech employees at a single tech firm. And all of these words are important, that these are only 200 workers. This is only over a period of 8 months, and it's only in a single firm. But take it as you may, there are some interesting findings from this that I think bring to light some dynamics that we're wrestling with regard to AI in the classroom. They did observations, they did interviews, and here's an interesting quote here from one of the interviews. "You had thought that maybe you'd save some time, you work less, but then really you don't work less." And this is something that the researchers found, is that 83% of the workers whom they were shadowing and interviewing said that AI actually increased their workload. As a result, or certainly related, 62% reported, this is of associates, and we'll talk a little bit about the different levels at which it's impacting the workforce, but 62% of associate level employees reported burnout. And in this particular company, the typical workday length, which they're attributing to workload creep fomented by AI, was 12 hours. Teachers can relate to long work days. And I think one of the implications here is if there are time savings coming from the use of AI, what is the result of the time savings? Where does the time go if those time savings are real? And then what's the effect on the employee, in this case, in this study, at the tech company? But I think we have to ask ourselves, with all of the efficiency gains that are being touted by AI, I read on one company's website, an ed tech company just today, that there was this estimated savings of 40% of the teacher's time in grading students' work. They could save 40% of that time by using the tool. So if that's actually true, if that tool is right, and if the AI application here is right, what becomes of that time and what are the implications? There are 3 forms of work intensification, as the researchers put it. And they were task expansion was 1, blurred boundaries is 2, and more multitasking is 3. And I'll say that I can relate to actually each one of these myself personally. So I found the study interesting in this way. So task expansion, and this is by perhaps the sort of double-edged sword of AI. As the researchers found this, basically that when AI was speeding up tasks, then workers could absorb work that was previously deferred or outsourced, maybe even internally. Someone else was doing the work, and then they could handle it, and it got added to their list. Now, I've taken on, in a creative capacity, I think, some of the prototyping that we do in our product development process myself, because I've been able to prototype, in one case, a data report for administrators. I've been able to do that work myself using AI in a way that I would otherwise not have been able to, because I would have had to partner with other teams and other skill sets. And with the AI, I've been able to prototype it. And so I found that work to be energizing and liberating, but certainly it's added work to my plate. Now, that's work that I've chosen to take on. I think it would be a very different matter if there were work being given to me, and it was now part of my overall suite of responsibilities. The second implication here in the research was that it blurred boundaries, and that's not hard to see. And of course, if you're in education, you know what it feels like to have boundaries blurred, where if you can accomplish a task, if you set an agent onto a task and it's moving along and it's getting things done, you're tempted to stick with it and to do just one more thing. In a conversation yesterday, I'm at the moment in New Orleans at Plain Talk Literacy Conference. And yesterday we were having a conversation with a number of educators about the use of AI. And one of the reflections that I was sharing with the group was if you compare the behavior of using Google to the behavior of using GPT or any AI, there's a very different kind of a relationship in the task orientation, where with a Google search result, it was always understood that they were trying to get you to the result as quickly as possible. And in fact, I believe if Google saw you searching again for the same term, they would notch that up as a failure, as a failed search, because they hadn't returned the result and you had to do another query. And that kind of work put back on you was considered a failure of the system, a failure of the Google search. Whereas you use GPT, and the next thing the GPT wants you to do is ask another question. It wants you to go down the rabbit hole to do another search, so to speak, because it's encouraging you with each result with a new question. Would you like me to do this with these results? Would you like to do this? I can do this, and so on. And you can see how that can blur boundaries. You could just keep going and going, especially in a tech workplace. And then multitasking, that once you are using these AI tools and they're set onto a particular task, they'll notify you when they're done, but they're going to do that work for some number of minutes. And in the meantime, what are you going to do? You're going to open another tab and you're going to pursue some work, or you're going to, while something else is happening, you're going to set an AI onto a task. And so you're now switching back and forth. And we know from research that multitasking sounds like a thing, but it really isn't. What you're doing is devoting your attention to one thing and then devoting your attention to another. Something is happening in the background. In fact, it may be distracting to you to focus on the thing at hand because you know that there's a job that's being done that's going to be done at any moment. You're waiting for the oven timer to go off, so to speak. So here's 3 forms of work intensification. And as I mentioned, it doesn't hit in this research study, it doesn't hit each employee evenly. And you can see the C-suite is assigning the work, but really it's the entry-level folks who are feeling the brunt of it. And I think that's very interesting, this finding here that 61%, or in the associate level, this 61% of entry-level employees, 62% of associate-level employees, virtually identical there, are feeling the brunt of it. And from an educator's perspective, I think it's interesting to think about preparing the next generation of workforce and the experience that they're going to have being given AI tools, being given increased responsibilities to put these tools to work and take on more and more. And especially in the early years of one's career, that can lead to a pretty intense sense of obligation and burnout, because there is an inability to self-regulate in the face of your boss telling you, hey, I need this thing and this other thing and this other thing, and don't worry, you've got a bunch of tools you can bring to bear on it. So the researchers suggest there's 3 possible fixes, and I'd say none of these really feels that adequate, but I'll just give you their perspective on this. One is intentional pauses, building in scheduled reflection. I think that sounds easier than it is, of course, if you're an entry-level employee. The second is sequencing, regulating the order and pace of AI-enabled tasks. So not just sitting in front of your computer and just AIing your way through everything. And then along with that, they're calling human grounding. You don't want to just be facing a screen all day and interacting with the technology. You've got to bring humans into the conversation, which is something that we've been doing a lot at Newsella, and I can certainly appreciate that we have a lot of conversations and a lot of back and forth about the use of the AI, which I think is entirely normal and probably quite expected. And just to turn this lens, as we close out this episode, turn this lens to AI and the implications for the teacher workforce and the workload, it does raise some questions for me, and I'll just go through these. And I don't think any of them has quick answers, but I think they're worth bearing in mind. This idea of AI saving teachers time, if it's able to compress tasks and enable you as a teacher to take on more and more, do you actually have downtime now? Are you actually released from your obligations to do some of the other work? Or now that you can do that, it's compressed. What took you an hour takes you 10 minutes, and now your 50 minutes isn't returned to you. It's actually filled with new things because your productivity, so to speak, is increased. There's also a question, I think, of what is the work that's being affected and impacted by the AI? What kind of work is it? And I mentioned earlier when I was talking a little bit about Google and its introduction of suggested feedback comments into the Google Docs and Google Suite, what that could do to co-opting the teacher voice. If the AI starts to speak more for the teacher, what happens to the teacher's sense of judgment, voice, ownership, agency in their own classroom? And then how are districts redesigning work? How intentional is that? Is this just adding to the number of things that they're asking of teachers? So I'd love to know your experience of this. I've talked to a lot of educators and trying to keep my finger on the pulse, but if you're an educator who's been directly affected and you've seen your workload increase or the nature of your job, not by your own direction, I think is important. How is that showing up for you? And then I'll preview a conversation we're going to have in our next episode. And this comes from Dan Meyer. Many of you probably already read his blog. He's really questioning the validity of this claim in this other study that AI is saving teachers who use it the equivalent of 6 weeks of school per year. He suspects the finding is wrong. And I'm going to take a little time to dive into Dan Meyer's perspective. And again, what are the implications for how we think about AI arriving in the classroom? What does this actually mean with all this time savings, all this efficiency? Is it really about two types of people, as Mark Cuban says, people who are using it to increase the rate at which they are learning and people who are using it to avoid learning entirely? So thanks for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode, and please hit us up in the comments if you have thoughts on any of what you've heard, especially if you're a classroom teacher and you can relate or you can challenge anything that you've heard here. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.